Welcome to the CultureLab. I'm your host, Bajer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It gives you the tools and inspiration to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. This is where we explore how to cultivate remarkable cultures that scale and evolve as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
But we are moving in an era where in the United States in the year 2025, basically 2 years from now, the majority of Americans will have a younger boss. So this idea of intergenerational collaboration started being interesting to me. I was a boomer. Almost everybody around me was a millennial. And one day someone said, "Chip, we love you because you're our modern elder." And I said, "I don't want to be your modern elder. That sounds like I'm about to be carted off to a retirement home." And they said, No. A modern elder is someone who's as curious as they are wise. And I said, wow, curiosity and wisdom, those are two of my superpowers on a good day. I ended up owning the term and saying, yes, I am Airbnb's modern elder. You know, the difference between a modern elder and a traditional elder, an elder of the past, is the elder of the past was regarded and appreciated with a reverence for them. But that doesn't happen so much in Western society anymore. This is not about reverence. This is about relevance.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 123 of the CultureLab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrain, a one-of-a-kind accelerator program where culture leaders get hands-on support and guidance on how to reach their goals faster, especially now in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. CultureBrain connects you with outstanding peers on the same journey, but also with world-class experts, including people you know from the show. And they all help you identify and implement new, better ways of creating a culture where people do their best work. Check it out at tinyurl.com/culturebrain. And no need to write it down. There's a link in the show notes. And here is a message from our friends Frances Fry and Anne Morris about their fantastic new TED podcast.
Hi, I'm Frances Fry.
And I'm Anne Morris.
And we are the hosts of a new TED podcast called Fixable.
We've helped leaders at some of the world's most competitive companies solve all kinds of problems.
On our show, we'll pull back the curtain and give you the type of honest, unfiltered advice we usually reserve for top executives.
Maybe you have a coworker with boundary issues, or you want to know how to inspire and motivate your team.
No problem is too big or too small. Give us a call and we'll help you solve the problems you're stuck on. Find Fixable wherever you listen to podcasts.
This month, we are kicking off a brand new series that hits at the heart of today's work environment, the multigenerational workforce. Why is this a big deal? Well, for the first time in history, we've got up to 5 generations sharing the same office space. Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, and even some silent generation folks are in the mix. And it's a bit like a family reunion, but for a minimum of 40 hours a week. And frankly, not everyone's playing nice. You've got your tech-savvy digital natives who live and breathe tech. And on the flip side, you've got the experienced folks who've seen more than a few office fads come and go. And each group has its own way of doing things, its own priorities, and its own expectations about what work is supposed to be. It's a melting pot of perspectives. But let's be honest, it's also a hotbed for tension and misunderstandings. That's why we're dedicating this series to unpacking the challenges and opportunities that come with a multi-generational workforce. Our guest for this episode? None other than the incredible Chip Conley. Chip is not new to shaking things up. He first turned the hospitality industry on its head by founding Joie de Vivre Hospitality, and then he did it again at Airbnb as their head of global hospitality and strategy. Now he's on to his third act with the Modern Elder Academy, and his latest book, Learning to Love Midlife, 12 Reasons Why Life Gets Better with Age, is about to hit the shelves this coming January. Chip's going to challenge the way you think about age, especially in a professional context. He says that the so-called digital natives aren't the only ones that bring value to the table, and I couldn't agree more. He says that experience isn't just a resume filler. It's about to make a major comeback. I'm glad to hear that. And so if you've ever felt overshadowed by the new generation or pressured by the TikTok of the age clock, you're going to want to listen up. In this episode, we'll hit on some golden nuggets like how being an outsider in various settings has expanded Chip's worldview and how it can help expand yours. The concept of a modern elder and what it means in today's workplace. The need for democratizing company culture so everyone's got a seat at the table. And why intergenerational mentorship could be the secret sauce for employee retention and engagement. Not enough for you? We also dive into the complicated relationship between career and health, especially when life throws you curveballs like cancer. It's a conversation packed with insights that could change how you approach work, life, and everything in between. So grab a cup of your favorite brew, put those earbuds in, and settle down for a conversation that might just make you see age and work in a whole new light. Let's get into it.
I'm Chip Conley, and I am a longtime hospitality entrepreneur and best-selling author who is excited about culture.
Chip, welcome to the CultureLab.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's the right place to be if you're excited about culture, this show, because this is our focus. And I've been waiting for this conversation for so long because where your work focuses is an area that a lot of our listeners are super interested in as well. So I can't wait to dive in. But before we go there, I always ask the same question to kick off the conversation to every single guest. And the question is about the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person. How did you grow up and what impact did it have on who you are today?
So I grew up in Southern California in the United States. And what was interesting about my upbringing was that I went to inner city high school. At junior high school, it was very mixed race, but my inner city high school was predominantly non-white. It was an environment in which I, as a white boy, was a minority. It really taught me that I was culturally curious. I was fascinated by other cultures. I'm 62 now, so this was a long time ago. And instead of having homecoming kings and queens, which is something that they do in the United States, we had cultural ambassadors. So we had basically from each of the different major races, and 4 different major races in the school, you'd have a boy and a girl representing that particular race. And the homecoming activities we'd have would be about learning about other cultures. So I was really fortunate to go to a public school, public high school, that was actually academically strong, athletically strong, and it helped me to see what it means to be the other. And I think that's such an important, especially if you're in the dominant demographic, and if you're a white person in the United States, you are, to understand what it means to be the other is actually such an important influence at an early stage in your life. Be able to be empathetic and considerate of alternative points of view and alternative ways of growing up.
I can so relate to that because I grew up in the communist Poland and was a very homogenous society. And I had no idea what it even means to be the other until I traveled abroad for the first time at the age of 16. And then suddenly, I had the wrong accent, I looked differently, and the very essence, I think, of my being was really standing out and not in a good way. And I think the highlight of that experience is exactly what you talk about, developing that empathy and understanding what this experience is really like for others. And I carry it through my life, and it probably explains to a great extent my interest in diversity and inclusion. And I can only imagine that it probably also marked you and your interest in diversity, especially when it comes to giving equal opportunities to people of various ages and in various age groups. And I'm sure that we'll go there.
We're going to go there. You look at me and you'd say, oh, well, that's just a straight white guy. Well, I'm not straight. I'm gay. They call it cisgender, I guess. But I come across as potentially a straight guy, but I've been a gay man and out since I was 22. the process of being the white guy in the non-white school and being then the closeted gay boy and then gay man dating women, being on a all-American water polo team at Stanford, being in a fraternity. I mean, and then coming out meant I was the other again. And then as I got older, and we'll talk about my experience at Airbnb, when I was the old guy, I was the other again. I was surrounded by millennials and I was a boomer. I think it's just exceptionally important for us to know what it's like to be in that role of the other. Because being the other, there is a burden that comes with it and there's a liberation that comes with it. The burden is often you are judged because you're the minority as the representative of your demographic. So if you're the only woman in a room, you're judged as the woman. If you're the only black person in the room, oh, you represent your whole race. That's a burden. That's a lot to carry. The liberation comes from the fact that you actually have the ability to get out of the group think mode and out of that communist Poland experience you had, which is monochromatic. It's like you represent innovation. You represent idiosyncrasies. You represent the ability to be different. And organizations need that. So, burden and liberation, it's both.
It absolutely is. I love that. I know that you have a favorite quote, and we found it during our research. And I want to ask you this question because I'm really curious about your second day. So the quote is from Mark Twain, and he said, "The two most important days in your life are the day you are born and the day you find out why." Tell me about your second day.
I started a boutique hotel company, one of the first in the United States, in the mid-1980s when I was 26 years old. And I thought I was starting that company because I was fascinated with the hotel business and with design. And boutique hotels were taking boring hotels and turning them into design hotels. And again, as a gay man, that was sort of particularly interesting to me. I had a good eye for design. And I think as a gay man, I had felt more comfortable being in the service industry, not having to be macho, but instead being like, I'm here to serve. But I would say that the sense of having a calling or the sense of like, why am I on this earth came from my role as a 26-year-old CEO of a company that I wanted to grow into a big company. It was called Joie de Vivre. The boutique hotel company was called that. Each of the 52 hotels we ultimately had its own name. But I think my understanding why was really, I want to create a company that becomes a role model for culture. And I want to use my experience as a CEO in the company that I've created as a laboratory at the intersection of psychology and business, and understanding how do we incorporate psychology into how we operate. And that has led me to writing 7 books now, almost all of them at the intersection of psychology and business. So sometimes people start a company to go make money. Sometimes people start a company because they love being an entrepreneur. I actually think at the end of the day, I started a company because I wanted to create a laboratory for understanding humans in the context of organizations and then go write about it so that I could be a thought leader on the subject of culture in organizations.
Was there a specific moment when you realized that this is actually why you're creating this business, or was it more of an evolution and a process?
It's definitely an evolution, but I would say it was when I started being asked to give speeches. And this was maybe when I was in my mid-30s. At that point, we probably had about 6 hotels. So to be a CEO of a company with 6 hotels at 35, let's say, that was really unusual. So I was asked to give speeches a lot. And people would ask me, like, so what are you going to talk about on stage? And I was like, I don't know. I'm just going to get up there and tell them, here are the principles that I've used as a leader. And what became clear to me was how hungry and how thirsty people were for new approaches to leadership. And that's what led me to writing my first book called The Rebel Rules, Daring to Be Yourself in Business. So long story short is, I think it was the combination of seeing what I was learning as a CEO, going out and talking about it in speeches, and then writing about it. And it was that evolution from being the internal person running a company to being the external person saying, here's what I'm learning along the way. I don't want to hold these truths that I'm learning just in my company. I want to share them with other people.
I know that we're not going to do justice to all of these years that you were honing this craft and learning about how to cultivate a thriving culture. But if you were to share your biggest learning during that period with our listeners around how do you go about creating an environment where people do their best work? What's the most important thing?
I'm a big believer in the service profit chain, which is a Harvard Business School philosophy and a book with that name, which in essence believes that if you create a great culture in an organization, it leads to happy employees, loyal customers, growing market share, and a sustainable and profitable business. And then with that, those profits you invest back in the culture. It's like a virtuous circle. So starting from that premise that a great company is defined by its employee satisfaction surveys, not its profitability, because profitability is a lagging indicator of success. A leading indicator is how happy are the employees and how engaged are they, etc. So I start with that premise. And then I go to the perspective that I really believe that culture needs to be democratized. I don't think the culture is owned by the CEO, although the CEO absolutely needs to be an advocate for it. It's not owned by the head of HR. It is something that needs to be democratized so that everybody feels like they're a part of it. So how do you do that? I mean, at Joie de Vivre or at Airbnb, where I went to after I sold my company, so much of it was actually creating avenues or mediums for people in the company, employees in the company, to talk about what they want the company to do. So, for example, we've democratized philanthropy in Joie de Vivre, such that each of our different 52 hotels and 25 restaurants and 4 spas, it was the employees within those individual businesses that were making the decision of how they were going to, as a particular property, connect with local nonprofits, NGOs, and causes that they wanted to actually support. So it wasn't me as the CEO making those decisions. It was there. Additionally, innovation needed to happen. Sometimes there's like the innovation lab of a company. Well, no, our innovation lab was literally the housekeepers in the company. We would have senior leaders in the company go and do an innovation day with every single one of our businesses. So you'd have housekeepers and front desk hosts and bartenders sitting in an all-day innovation session. So many of the best ideas of the company came from that. And I wrote a lot about this in my book, Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow, based upon the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs applied to organizations. So I just think that we really sometimes think that the process of creating a great culture happens sort of in the far senior leaders of the company. Those people need to believe it and show reverence for it and not just talk, but walk the talk as well. But at the end of the day, if you don't create a culture that feels democratic, where every single employee feels like their fingerprints are on it, then you have created something where people become passive spectators as opposed to active participants.
I mean, it's scary how similar we are and, how many commonalities there are and common threads in our lives and the way we think. Because actually, I'm now working on my second book, Culture Craft, and the main thesis of the book is exactly that culture is not a mandate. Culture needs to be a movement and it needs to be co-created. So what the book is talking about is how you can engage your entire organization and every single person in taking responsibility for creating that environment where great things can happen and where innovation can thrive. It's so great to hear that. And coincidentally, I'm also quite intimately actually familiar with a hospitality business. My husband runs a W, which actually is very close in philosophy to what you have created. And I love that example around, take your housekeepers and engage them in their process because they know best. And it really rings so true for me. So there's so much wisdom that you have gained along the way. And so I can only imagine that this journey has led you to the concept of the modern elder. But for our listeners, and actually I know that it has, but for our listeners who are not familiar with your journey, can you share a little bit about the journey and the concept of modern elder?
So for 24 years, I ran that company, Joie de Vivre, and I loved it until I hated it. I loved it for about 21 years. And then the last 2 or 3 years was really hard. And it was not just hard because we were going through the Great Recession. That was part of it. But we'd been through downturns before. It was more that I didn't want to do it anymore. I felt a bit like a prisoner. I built my jail cell, and the jail cell was the company I'd created. We had 3,500 employees at that point, and I just didn't feel like I had a way out. It was really hard. I mean, in retrospect, it was definitely the hardest time of my life. And a bunch of things happened that led me to ultimately deciding to sell that company at the bottom of the Great Recession. And I felt liberated. I felt stupid at the same time, though, because, I felt like, wow, if I'd waited, it was 24 years. If I'd waited just another 3 or 4 years, it would have been financially much smarter to wait. But I knew I needed to do something else. I wasn't sure what it was yet, though. There's a great quote from the movie The Intern with Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway, and he was the senior intern to her. Robert De Niro says, musicians don't retire, they quit when there's no more music left inside of them. So I know I had music inside of me, but I wasn't sure who to share it with. And I was 50 years old. I spent a couple of years doing a variety of things, just sort of being curious. I hadn't had much of a space to be curious. And I went around the world studying festivals. I was a founding board member of Burning Man, which is a famous festival in the US. And I wanted to understand festivals and religious pilgrimages. And I really wanted to understand why people come together for celebrations. And then I also wanted to understand emotions. So I wrote a book called Emotional Equations that became a New York Times bestseller. So it was a great 2.5 years that I had off. And then I got a call from one of the 3 founders of Airbnb, Brian Chesky, who was the CEO. And he said, Chip, I want you to come and help us to democratize hospitality. And I said, well, who the hell are you? I didn't know who Brian was. Frankly, this was 11 years ago. I didn't really know what Airbnb was, even though I was in San Francisco and he was in San Francisco and the company was in San Francisco. And long story short is that was my journey for the next 7.5 years, 4 years full-time, 3.5 years part-time as a strategic advisor. And within the first month or two after being there, so just to be clear, I had been CEO of my own company for 24 years. I had a couple of years off, and now I'm joining Airbnb. I was going to be the mentor to the 3 founders. That my title was head of global hospitality and strategy. But my real role was to be the mentor to the 3 founders, to take this little tech startup and take it mainstream and global. And what was so curious about that time was I was mentoring Brian, but I was also reporting to him. So I was 52 years old and he was 31. And so to report to your mentee is unusual. But we are moving in an era where in the United States in the year 2025, to basically 2 years from now, the majority of Americans will have a younger boss. So this idea of intergenerational collaboration started being interesting to me. I was a boomer. Almost everybody around me was a millennial. And one day someone said, Chip, we love you because you're our modern elder. And I said, I don't want to be your modern elder. That sounds like I'm about to be carted off to a retirement home. And they said, no. A modern elder is someone who's as curious as they are wise. And I said, wow, curiosity and wisdom. Those are 2 of my superpowers on a good day. I ended up owning the term and saying, yes, I am Airbnb's modern elder. The difference between a modern elder and a traditional elder, an elder of the past, is the elder of the past was regarded and appreciated with a reverence for them. But that doesn't happen so much in Western society anymore. So this is not about reverence. This is about relevance. And relevance means that as someone who's been around a little bit longer and maybe developed some wisdom, because really wisdom is just about metabolizing your experience, your life lessons. Your job is to make your wisdom relevant to the people who surround you. And if you can do that well, then you've become like a master mentor for people. But a lot of people who are my age, turning 63 in a couple months, don't do this well. And this is why the okay boomer phenomenon came along a few years ago, which is just because you have war stories doesn't make it wisdom. If you go into a conversation with someone 20 years younger than you and just say, let me tell you, Sonny, this is how the world works. And then you recite a world that doesn't really exist for that person anymore, you're not relevant. I think one of the biggest fears that people have as they get older is feeling irrelevant. I know a lot of people who are older who don't really have the curiosity. They think they have the wisdom, but they don't have the curiosity to try to understand how to make what they've learned relevant based upon being curious about context as well as what the person needs. So over my course of my time at Airbnb, I had over 100 mentees. Yes, one of them was the CEO, and frankly, the three founders were three of my 100. But to have over 100 mentees over the 7.5-year period meant I really deeply got to understand what the role of a mentor is and how it works when you're getting it right and how it doesn't work when you're getting it wrong. Yeah, that was quite an experience.
I love that. I love that almost a formula, I suppose, to be a modern elder, which is curiosity combined with metabolized wisdom. But you also said that during your time in Airbnb, you were an intern. And that's part of that experience that was so incredibly important was actually interning publicly while you were mentoring privately. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and tell us what the difference is?
Yeah, I coined the term mentor. I was a mentor and an intern at the same time. And what that means is that, first of all, to be a mentor and an intern at the same time is basically saying, sometimes I'm the wise one, sometimes I'm the curious one. When it came to my relationship with Brian, we mutually mentored each other. I was particularly helpful for him on subjects around emotional intelligence or EQ, because let's recognize that, when you're 31 years old as a CEO and you're running a company that's growing very fast, you've got to microwave your EQ. So my role was partly to accelerate his EQ in the context of leadership. His role was to actually mentor me on DQ, digital intelligence. I was someone who didn't understand the digital world all that well. I'll just be honest. So what I experienced from that was with Brian was the best thing I can do is if I've witnessed Brian doing something that I think he's not doing well, like let's say he's running our leadership meeting, my job was not to mentor him publicly in the meeting and say, hey, Brian, I think you're making a mistake here. That would only embarrass him or create a fight. So I would mentor him privately. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. But I would intern publicly. And what that means is that I would ask a lot of questions around things I didn't know. And I used a method called appreciative inquiry, which is a beautiful way of creating catalytic questions based upon opening up possibilities. It can be critical thinking, but it's critical thinking with the idea of positivity sort of built into it. So I would often intern publicly in a meeting, and initially people might say, oh my God, he doesn't understand what we're talking about. And then by the third question I was asking, they're like, oh, wow, he has seen our blind spot. I don't think we'd ever thought of that before. And so as the intern, because you can sometimes be the naive one, you also have the fresh eyes to sometimes see the things that people aren't seeing because they're so habitual about this. Yes, I enjoyed having both the role of the mentor and the intern.
I'm curious, Chip, from your perspective, when you think about what organizations can do to help people to embrace that mindset of being a mentor and bringing curiosity and thinking about relevance, because what you've described, in terms of that approach, let me tell you how the world works. I think it's one of the reasons why older generation is not appreciated in the workplace. And I wonder whether employers can do anything to help people maintain their relevance and develop the skills that they need to be a modern elder within the organization.
Well, I would say one thing. This is part of the reason we created the Modern Elder Academy, the world's first midlife wisdom school, which is, after my Airbnb time, something that I felt very motivated to do because I felt like there's all these people in their 40s, 50s, 60s in the workplace, and they often don't get the learning and development dollars or attention that younger employees in an organization get. And it's almost like we sort of have this philosophy that you fuel up in your late teens and your 20s with schooling, and it's like you fill the tank of your life, the vehicle of your life. You fill it with gas, and then you're supposed to actually drive that car without a pit stop or without another fuel up till you retire. And now we're going to retire in our 70s. So this is nuts, 50 years without any kind of midlife pit stop. And so on a personal level, I decided to create, MEA, the Modern Elder Academy, the world's first midlife wisdom school. And a lot of companies send their people there, which is why I brought it up. But what could a company do? Well, what a company can do is to start, especially if you've got employees who have been in the company for a while, maybe they've earned some time for learning and development. I would say if I were like head of culture or head of HR or head of learning and development in a company, is like, we talk about sabbaticals after you've been there 5 years, 10 years, whatever. So you could still do sabbaticals, but what about a learning sabbatical? What about every 5 years you are given something extra that's learning oriented? Because often what we think about when we say people want extra time off, great. We don't usually as companies think about, okay, how are we investing in their, not just their personal development, but their professional development as well, but in a way that is perfect for that person. So I think, if every 5 years you got to significantly increase the investment that the company's making in you, whether it's going to an extra couple of conferences or taking a month-long approved sabbatical to focus on being in a Stanford or a Harvard or INSEAD program that allows you to go deep in that program, not just like a week, but like like a deeper program. I think it's important because the risk we have with mature and tenured employees is we're not giving them that refueling in midlife that they need. And so it's part of the reason why MEA, the organization I started after I left Airbnb, has flourished, because so many companies realize we have some great employees here, and we really should send them to a midlife wisdom school that helps people to understand how do you unearth the wisdom you've learned along the way so you can share it with others.
Yes, and that is so important, right? It's clearly a huge motivator for these organizations, because you're not just helping these people to sort of design the second act or whatever. It's really helping them to figure out how they can pay it forward now and how they can support the organization to be more successful. I love that.
Deloitte has shown that when and developing mutual mentorships within companies is helpful. Deloitte has shown that when a millennial employee has an in-house mentor within the company, they are twice as likely to stay at least 5 years as someone who doesn't have a mentor. So creating mentorship and investing in mentorship within the company is not just a great knowledge or wisdom exchange. It's a retention tool, because you actually create loyalty and a reason for a person to stay.
100%. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the future and how your thinking has evolved. You've written this wonderful book, Wisdom at Work, but it's been a few years since its publishing, and I'm sure that your thinking has evolved since then. You've received feedback. There are some stories that changed the way you think about what you've written and how you think about a modern elder. So what is the new way of thinking that you are playing with? And generally, where do you think we need to focus our efforts moving forward?
Some of my thinking has just evolved. It hasn't changed. It's more evolved. And what that means is I think I have a more precise idea of what can be done. In that book, Wisdom at Work, the 9th chapter has 10 different suggestions for a CEO or a head of HR around how to create more intergenerational collaboration. Only 8% of Fortune 1000 companies around the world currently use age as a metric to determine diversity in the workplace.
8%.
Only
Wow.
8%. So we use race, we use gender, we use maybe even sexual orientation. But very, very few companies use age. And I just think that in a workplace where we have 5 generations for the first time, and where we have a growing number of people who are actually older people reporting to younger people, these are new phenomena. So people staying in the workplace longer, having workplace relationships such that some of the power is moving to younger people, needing to actually figure out in a low unemployment world, which has been very much the case in the US, how do we retain people longer? All of these things are the kinds of things that, to my mind, were important when I wrote the book 5 years ago, but are even more important today in the world we live in. So I just think that's the starting point. I would say that one thing that's evolved for me in the last 5 years is my understanding of midlife, which is a really sort of weird era of like, when does midlife start? When does it end? It doesn't really have precise boundaries. Sociologists now consider it 35 to 75. That's a long time. So what I've really come to understand is that midlife is a period of time when people are going to go through a major amount of transition. And we as companies and as a society have done precious little to help people understand what is the roadmap of midlife. So I've written a new book that'll come out in January called Learning to Love Midlife. And the subtitle is 12 Reasons Why Life
Gets better with age, I
Gets
think.
Better with Age.
Yeah,
There you go. Thank you.
Sure.
So I think the biggest shift I've been making is this idea of moving from just like, okay, how is the intergenerational collaboration going to work, to really understanding the psychology of midlife, to really understand. I lost 5 male friends to suicide, all of them in midlife
Oh, God.
during the Great Recession.
So sorry.
And so to see that and to see how many people get a little lost, often around 45 to 50. There's a social science research that shows this thing called the U curve of happiness. And the U curve of happiness shows that basically between early 20s and around 45 to 50, our life satisfaction has a long, slow decline. It bottoms out around 45 to 50. Again, these are averages. So each of us can be very different. On average, it bottoms out between 45 and 50. And then starting around age 50 and beyond, with each decade, we get happier and happier until just around the end of our life. So it's like a U curve from happy in our 20s to unhappy around 45 to 50 to happy again. And it's such interesting research that's been shown globally. And yet it's so at odds with the way we think of, aging. Like, oh my God, if I can survive my midlife crisis, on the other side of that, I have disease, decrepitude, and death. And in fact, what we've found and what the research is showing is that often people get happier after age 50. So sort of like life begins at 50. So my focus has moved from just the workplace, and Wisdom at Work is a book about the workplace, to Learning to Love Midlife is broader than just the workplace. It is like saying, okay, how do we help people in midlife and beyond recognize that their best years may be ahead of them?
You've mentioned transitions, and I heard you speak about transitions and 3 stages of transitions beautifully. And I really think that it would be super useful for our listeners because, first of all, everyone who listens to this probably experienced transitions in their personal life, but also at work, actually. And I don't think that we are fully equipped in the right understanding of what a transition even is and what to expect. Can you unpack it a little bit for us?
Yeah, I'll define change versus transition. Don't get too wrapped up in the lingo. I will use the words interchangeably. But when you're going through a change in your life, you're changing your spouse, you're getting divorced, you're getting married to someone else, you're changing your job. Change is often circumstantial and situational. It's often external. So in a change, you actually may be changing your boss, but 2 years later, you're now complaining about the same things about with your new boss, or the same thing with your spouse. Like, oh, I was complaining about my ex, and now I'm complaining the same things about this. Okay, something changed, but there wasn't a transition, because a transition is not so much circumstantial or situational, it's psychological and spiritual. It's when something changed inside of you. The landscape didn't change. The transition is when you changed. It's profound and can be painful. So at MEA, we have something called the Anatomy of a Transition. It's a paper we've written, and we have both workshops as well as online courses on this. I think the online course is called Navigating Midlife Transitions. So the 3 stages of a transition are, number 1, the ending of something, which is weird that that's the start. The start is the ending. The second stage is the messy middle. And the third stage is the beginning of something new. And if you look at things that have shifted in your life, often that transition chronology had those 3 stages to it. But we didn't necessarily recognize, like, okay, what do you do? What are the rules or tools or tips that help you through the ending of something, which is frankly ritualizing it, or the messy middle, which is really about social support and trying to find the through line, the narrative that helps you understand how to make meaning out of this period. And then the third stage being the beginning of something. And that's when you need to have a growth mindset and a willingness not to judge yourself too harshly. When you have a fixed mindset, you tend to focus on proving yourself and winning. When you have a growth mindset, again, this is based upon Carol Dweck's work at Stanford, When you have a growth mindset, you focus on improving yourself, not proving yourself. And success is not winning, it's learning. And so that mindset, the growth mindset, when you become a beginner again, allows you to be that butterfly. I mean, if you look at the caterpillar to butterfly journey, there's the caterpillar, the ending of something, moving into the chrysalis where the transformation happens, but it's also sort of dark and gooey. And then on the other side of that, the beginning of the new butterfly is that it starts to flap its wings, which are wet, and it ends up on the ground usually first. And then it has to start getting used to how do you fly. So I believe, and I gave a TED talk that'll be coming out this fall on the TED.com website. It was at the big TED conference. I gave a talk on the midlife chrysalis, not the midlife crisis. And I believe deeply that our key lesson in life is to recognize that to be in transition is to be liminal. Life is liminal. And when we were in puberty or adolescence, everybody celebrated that we were constantly in transition or change. Somehow, when we get into our 40s, 50s, and 60s, we feel like, oh my God, if I'm in transition or if I'm liminal, something's wrong with me. No, it's normal. and yet we have to help people through it, because often when you're going through a change at around 50, you feel like, oh my God, I don't know how to do this. And the truth is you do. And the key is to have the tools. And that's, I mean, literally this, I'm preaching from my hymnal here in terms of, this is what MEA is all about.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing it. And one other thing a thread that I want to pull from what you said before is about the subtitle, actually, of your new book and the 12 reasons why life gets better with age. Can you give us one that resonates with you most?
I'll give you 2 or 3, and I'll be brief. Can I swear on this or no?
Go for it. Yes.
As we get older, we start to realize that we should appreciate our own counsel more, and we should be really good editors. And so there's a point at which we say, I have no more fucks left to give. And what that means is, it doesn't mean you don't care about anybody anymore. It just means you're more discerning about what you do care about. You don't worry as much about what other people think. You worry more about what you think, and you get clearer on like what you think. And I think that's something that gets better with age. Obviously, emotional intelligence is something based upon the research. And emotional moderation gets better with age. We're not quite as much of a pinball in a pinball machine, reacting as much. Time affluence. After age 50, people start getting more time in their life for a variety of reasons, often because they are moving out of the sandwich generation, although actually lots of people in their 50s are in the sandwich generation, taking care of elderly parents while also taking care of your kids. But time affluence gives you space to be curious again. Actually, I'll give you one last one, because I want to say this. So I believe that we are so brainwashed in this culture by anti-aging messages.
Oh, God. Yes.
And products. Most anti-aging products are anti-women products. Let's start with that. They're meant to help a woman feel like she's not getting older, or she's got to worry about what she looks like, which at some point women need to say, you know what? Do I need to actually worry about that? Do I need to look like the high school cheerleader anymore? So there's the anti-aging there. And then there's a whole new phenomenon in the last 10 or 15 years, which is the longevity products. So the anti-aging stuff is sort of like all about women. And then there's this other piece, which is like, I'm going to live forever products. And it's like Silicon Valley leaders saying, okay, well, we're going to, biohacking. So you've got the women having to deal with anti-aging products. You have this men feeling like they have to live forever. And I'm all about where are the pro-aging products? Becca Levy at Yale has shown that when people can shift their mindset on aging from a negative to a positive, they gain 7.5 years of additional life, which is more life than if you actually stopped smoking at 50, or if you started exercising at 50.
Wow.
But where are the public service announcements and the social support saying, hey, let's be pro-aging? Some things get better with age. Yes, your body, just as you get comfortable in your own skin, it starts to sag. That is true. Your body may not be as good as it used to be, but your heart and your soul, and in certain ways, your mind is better. Now, it is true that we are not as good at memory, or not as quick with comprehension sometimes. But as Arthur Brooks wrote about in From Strength to Strength, we go from fluid to crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is our ability to connect the dots and think holistically. And that becomes better up until your early to mid 70s.
Oh my gosh, this is so incredibly powerful. I had no idea, first of all, that just reframing the way we think about aging can add so many years to our lives. And I think it's a testament to how this is completely not on our radar, and how this message needs reinforcing and spreading the word. So I want to ask about something that you've alluded to, that yes, there are many great things that happen in midlife, and I definitely experienced it myself. I'm 52 and life has never been better in many different ways. But at the same time, I face challenges that come with age. And I know that you have as well. And you've been incredibly open about your battle with prostate cancer and the impact it had on your life, on your sexuality, on your psyche, and so on. So, and I heard you actually say that cancer can be a great teacher. So I'm curious, what has it taught you, and how has this experience reshaped the way you look at life?
My cancer journey has been 5 years long. I found out the day after my book came out, Wisdom at Work, and the day before I was giving a TED Talk, that I had intermediate stage prostate cancer. Long story short is 5 years later, I have now had my prostate taken out, radical prostatectomy, but it had spread to my lymphs. So in my pelvic lymph. So I've had biopsies there, and I've had to go on hormone depletion therapy and a whole collection of things. I'm in a better place now, for sure. So the good news is that I think progress is being made. But the cancer journey for me was, at some point, I had this feeling like, okay, have I failed my body, or is my body failing me? And it was like this war between me and my body. And then I got to a place where I asked cancer, what do you have to teach me? And I think the number one thing cancer taught me was that this is not a war between me and my body. My body is my best friend. My body is my rental vehicle for this lifetime. And if you are issued a rental vehicle when you're born, and your job is to take good care of it, and realize, though, as it gets older, it's going to have dents in it. And realize as it gets older, it's not going to look quite as pristine and beautiful as it did when you drove it off the lot originally. And realize as you get older that what's most important in that rental vehicle is what's inside the rental vehicle, not what's on the external. It's like, is it comfortable inside that rental vehicle? And so for me, the cancer journey has been very much one of, how do I inhabit my body as my best friend? How do I realize that how I look is less important than how I feel? And how I feel has a lot to do with how I treat my body. So I'm better in terms of my nutrition and my exercise and all of that. But I also am become more vulnerable, and maybe more humble, and also maybe more in the moment. One of the beautiful things about having threats to your health, I mean, there's not a lot of bad things about it, that's for sure. But one of the good things is Laura Carstensen at Stanford has shown that it means that you're more in the moment, because you're less focused on the future. And this is a lot of research on this. And if the more you focus on the moment and less on the future, generally speaking, the happier you are. So, and the more present you are. And I would say that that's another thing I've learned from cancer is, how do I inhabit my presenceness? How do I show up in my relationships with people by being more present? Because we live in a world where people are absent. That's the opposite of present. And the reason they're absent is because they're on their phone while they're talking to you, or because they're distracted, or because they're really focused on the future.
Yes, so true. First of all, thank you for sharing this with us. I know that a lot of people will fully feel seen, because a lot of people are going through similar stuff, and it's hard, and it really takes a lot to figure it out. I know it from personal experience with my most beloved family members. And I wanted to ask you around this issue again. When someone goes through this journey and is a cancer patient, how are they supposed to think about their career? Because obviously there is a moment when you need to take time off. And there are so many things at play. Like there is fear of what will your future look like. I think there are some real threats to your career because people might think that, when you come back, you will not be the same person and it's really hard to navigate. So I wonder if you have any words of wisdom for people who are going through this right now.
There's so many variables here. So I'm going to give some advice here, which is very dangerous because it really needs to be customized to the person. But what I'll say is, first of all, take care of yourself, assuming that you can't financially and your company will allow you to take a little bit of a break, do it. It's important to have the space. And that's hard for some people because there are a lot of workaholics in the world. And often we use our work as a distraction from our emotions. And so work's the thing we want to do when we are emotionally distraught because it's the thing that takes us away from our emotions. And yet then you have this health diagnosis that amplifies your emotions and maybe means that you're not supposed to work, which means like, oh no, it's like, how do I deal with this? And so it's hard. So let's start with that. It is hard. Secondly, gosh, this is the moment. I had a flatline experience at 47 where I died multiple times over the course of 90 minutes and woke me up to saying, I can't run this. I don't want to run this company anymore. Joie de vivre. I want to sell it. The beautiful thing about having a health diagnosis is it forces you to ask, gosh, if I only have 5 years left to live or 2 years left to live, let's just as a theoretical statement, is this what I'd want to do? Is this how I want to spend my time? And let's assume that you have to work because I don't want it to be like, okay, I'm going to just retire and retire for 60 years if I'm healthy. No, like you probably have to work. So what would you rather do? Or how could you make what you're doing now even more joyful? And so I think that's another piece. And then the process of coming back to work, if your choice is to come back into the same work that you were doing, is to come back. And the more you can say to the people you work with, here are some of my key lessons from this experience, and having some of those lessons relate to how you're going to be more effective in your work. Gosh, if I had an employee who came back from a cancer journey or any kind of health journey, and they told me, here's what they learned, and maybe there's 4 lessons and 2 of them relate to their work, and I feel like, wow, those are great lessons. I'm not only more invested in this person, I'm now going to have them be a role model. Because what that person has just shown me is something we talked about earlier. How do you metabolize your experience into wisdom? And sometimes our painful life lessons are the raw material for our future wisdom. And sometimes it's these awful life experiences, circumstances that accelerate our wisdom.
So true. I wish we had more time to discuss this, but I'm being mindful of time. I know that we only have a couple of minutes. So let's go for the rapid fire questions. And that's the moment where I ask you 5 questions in rapid succession. And the challenge here is to answer all 5 in under 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So let's go for it. So at Culture Brain, the company that I run, we are on a mission to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. And I want to ask you, Chip, what is your number 1 tip to bring more intergenerational belonging in the workplace?
It would be mutual mentorship. Create mutual mentorship programs within your company across generations.
And what are the signs that a company culture needs some work, perhaps even a major overhaul?
Disengagement, people leaving and people feeling disengaged.
Are there any companies that you admire for the culture? And if yes, why?
Oh, yeah. I mean, back in the heyday, I admired my friend Tony Hsieh's Zappos. And Tony was a good close friend and wrote the foreword for 2 of my books. And I spoke at Zappos a lot. I'm also a fan of Patagonia and Yvon Chouinard. I mean, I'm also a fan of Procter & Gamble in its own way because they have something called the Mastery Society, which is older workers having a bigger influence.
Are there any books, not necessarily on culture or leadership or age diversity, but maybe even philosophy or even literature that you believe folks who want to shape a thriving company culture should read?
Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Now, you wouldn't think of it as a leadership book, but when you're in a concentration camp and you're seeing humanity in the most challenging circumstances, you know what it takes to become a leader. And I think meaning is an incredibly important part of being a great leader.
Okay, so to wrap this all up, What is the question that I haven't asked you yet, but I should have?
How have you evolved your identity over time such that you are less focused on your ego and more focused on your soul?
How have you?
Oh, I thought I just had to give you the question. I do think around midlife, that's what happens, is there's an operating system change. I think the number one lesson for me was to go to Airbnb and go from being the CEO of my own company to being the guy behind the scenes, and to realize that the most important thing for me to consider in my life is I am what survives me. It comes from Erik Erikson, the developmental psychologist. What's most important is what survives me, not what's happening today. What happens today will influence what survives me. But, it's like planting that tree that you'll never be able to take the nap under because you will have passed, but other people will appreciate it.
Chip, people who have listened to this, I know that they will want to learn more about you, about your work, perhaps check out your Modern Elder Academy. What are the best online places for them to go to?
So they could go to chipconley.com, Conley. They could go to the modernelderacademy.com website, and they could check out my blog. So my blog is called Wisdom Well. It's a daily blog. It's free. If you subscribe to it, you just get an email from me each day. And it's a little microdose of wisdom and sort of the art of living. And I also post those on LinkedIn. So if someone wants just to, follow me on LinkedIn, you'll see those daily blogs.
I love it. And we'll put the links in the show notes. I'm definitely signing up for the newsletter. How do you find time to write a daily blog?
I write maybe 12, over the course of a half day on a weekend, every few weeks, every couple of weeks.
I see. Thank you so very much for this conversation. It was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Aga. Yes, thanks for the work you do.
Thank you. I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the CultureLab podcast. And this is the CultureLab team.
Anis and Labarawi, production manager.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for spending your time with Chip and me on this episode of the CultureLab podcast. If you found this chat insightful, inspiring, or useful, and I'm guessing you did since you're still here, do me a solid. Take a few seconds to share this episode. It could be on social media, through a text or an email. It really matters, even if you just share it with one other person. Just copy the link from your app and send it to a friend who's keen on finding fresh, practical ways to foster an awesome company culture. And ask them to give it a listen, and then get together and chat about what you've both learned. Because when podcasts like this spark conversations, and those conversations turn into actions, that's when we start making real changes in the workplace together. And if you are looking to dig deeper into these topics and connect with others who are shaping the culture within their organizations, consider joining Culture Brain, especially now because we are offering our listeners a 25% discount on the annual fees. To take advantage of this opportunity, mention this code when applying. And the code is CB25. To find out more and apply, head over to tinyurl.com/culturebrain. The link is in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to get free resources on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser. agabayer.com/resources. If you haven't subscribed to the CultureLab yet, please do it now. That's the best way you can support our work. And finally, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on the platform that you listen to. Thank you, and you are amazing for listening to this point. Not many people do.